Shalom, and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet. Joining me as always, Rabbi Barry Chesler and Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky. Shalom, guys, and happy
Shalom.
anticipatory Thanksgiving. We're recording this on Erev Thanksgiving. We are very, very delighted to be with you. Thank you for taking us into your homes, listening and watching to us. Watching us, you can email us at parshatalk@gmail.com with all of your Bible questions, your Parsha questions. We are delighted to share this time with you. And let's get right into it. Parashat Vayetzei. This is a very, very important Parsha, as we say every week. Every Parsha is an important Parsha.
One of the 55 most important Parshas.
I think so, because it's all about journey. It's all about...
That will stop when we can no longer say it's important.
Vayetzei, how does it start? It says, Vayetzei Yaakov mi Beersheva, Vayelech Harana. Okay, just to recap, Jacob is running away from Esav. He's running away from Esav because Esav wants to kill him. That's what we learned last week. He's also running to Lavan's household, that's Rivka's brother, in order to marry. Why? Because Rivka does not want him to marry, and both of them, Rivka and Yitzchak, don't want him to marry from the Canaanites. We talked about that. He goes on this journey.
The beauty of the Parsha, in part, is that the separation between the end of last week and the beginning of this week, because the Vayetzei Yaakov mi Beersheva v'yelech Harana, that's just a description of a journey. It's not fraught with any meaning as of yet, if we forget about last week. Right? Last week he was running away. This week he's, taking a trip.
Do you really think so? I think there is an element here of trying to escape not only the land, not only a situation, but I think a piece of his conscience. I have a lovely comment here, and it's Yachol Adam lihimalet miyad rafav. People can flee their pursuers while never breaking free of their conscience. Ach lo livroch me'atzmo mimachshvotav mizichronotav. They can't break free of their conscience and their past. That's Yair Jakovich. He's an Israeli scholar, Bible scholar. In other words, there's a psychological dimension to this. But before we get into any other dimension, Barry, why don't you share with us the Rashi comment on the first pasuk there, because I think it has a lot of great meaning for us.
So it's actually related to our conversation. So Rashi picks up on the idea that the verse mentions both the place where Yaakov left, Beersheva, and the place where he's going to Haran, and says quite rightly that we already know he's leaving Beersheva because that was last week. And so his comment is that Yitziat Tzaddik min hamakom oseh roshem, that when a tzaddik leaves a place, it makes an impression. He takes with it the glory, the splendor, the beauty of the place with him. And it raises the question, I think, one that I like to discuss with my high school students, is what kind of impressions do we want to take with us, and what kind of impressions do we want to leave behind? But I think, Elliot, to the point of our earlier conversation is that we would not have described Yaakov as a tzaddik last week. Here, fresh on a new journey, we could describe him as a tzaddik. It fits in with the beginning of the Parsha. It doesn't really fit the end of last week's Parsha.
Look, I know we're integrating the Midrash and the rabbinic tradition on Yaakov, and in a sense, there is the disjunction that is geographical enables him to sort through things. And perhaps we could redefine what being a tzaddik means. Being a tzaddik is you're not you don't start out as a tzaddik in life. You really have to work to it. And you have to be someone who is challenged morally constantly all the time. And that that's certainly encapsulated in Rashi's comment. Is it encapsulated in the words vayifga b'makom? Jeremy, you want to pick up on those two words, vayifga b'makom?
We have to. I want to get there in a second.
Yeah.
I want to note that I think the meaning of that, Rashi, is that when the tzaddik leaves, the place is different. So the covenantal project of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca has now shifted focus, and it's happening in Mesopotamia now. So Beersheba isn't the same place it was anymore in the absence of Yaakov. So I think that of course the deceptive thing that he wrestles with, and that great Zakovich quote that you gave us, Elliot, that you can't flee yourself. Wherever you go, there you are, right? You can't run away from yourself. That's very intense and absolutely true. And so Yaakov is having to wrestle with those things, and is going to, of course, next week in the most intense way of all, have to wrestle with himself. But I think that part of the claim is that it's not the same Beersheba anymore. He's and I want to share with you also one great passage from the Zohar. In the Zohar, the powers of evil or the dark forces in the world are called the Sitra Achra, the other side, the Achra, and they're turning on this line. Vayetzei Yaakov mi Beersheva, he leaves the realm of the Sfirot, the 7 lower Sfirot, Vayelech Harana, and he goes to the other side. He's got to have an encounter with all of the dark forces in the world as he goes out to meet Lavan and have to deal with all of that difficult stuff, which I think is a great comment about journeys, right? Because when you journey from the familiar to the unfamiliar, you meet the other. And we could mean that in that Zoharic sense of the other forces, the dark forces, or we could just mean it in a description of how it is that we encounter the great big wide world that we're unfamiliar with.
So here it's worth jumping ahead, I think. He's going to be wounded by his journey, right? He's going to be coming back into the land limping. And it makes me wonder whether we might see him wounded as he goes on his way to Haran with his dealings with Lavan, and both coming and going. When he meets him, when he's tricked into marrying Leah, and when he leaves in the middle of the night with his daughters, his children, and his flocks.
So would you say that, and here back to Vayifga b'makom, is there something embedded in the word Vayifga? I mean, today in modern Hebrew, pigua is an attack. Pigua is like, as we would say, it's a real body check. You get a pigua.
Canadians would say that.
You get really slammed into the boards with a pigua. I mean, it flattens you, but it's also, I mean, there's a spiritual dimension to Vayifga. And Jeremy, what you're saying is that this geographical journey is not only a geographical thing; it's really a journey into the unknown. It's classic in the terms of the folkloric motif of the hero embarking from the known to the unknown. And I always like to point out that we have a set of boundaries here, that he is going to cross over a river as a boundary, and he will cross over another river on the way back. And the story is loaded with markers, and they are specifically stone markers that are to this day, stone functions as a boundary marker. You can journey around many places in the United States and see stone markers that indicated either mile markers. It's called a milestone.
Milestone, right. I always think, as long as we're talking about having these conversations about, we all got to know each other in camp, and I always love to go running up at camp and run to Bull's Bridge, where you pass the Connecticut-New York border, and there's a milestone.
It's a marker. It's a stone marker, right?
Yeah, it's great. So Vayifga b'makom is the poetry and the poetic power of Vayifga is very, very rich. He happened upon the place. Well, I think the simple semantic translation is he happened upon this particular place, which, because of the revelation that he's going to get, he lays his head down on the stone and has this spectacular vision. Because of the revelation he's going to get, and he's going to wake up and say, "Oh my God, if I had known that this was such a special place, I never would have taken a nap here." Ein zakim beit Elohim v'zeh sha'ar hashamayim. Lo and behold, this turns out to be none other than the gateway to heaven. And so we have a tradition that he was at the spot of the Beit HaMikdash. It's a little confusing as Rashi talks us through, because it tells us that it's at Beit El, and Beit El is not the side of the Beit HaMikdash. So Rashi tells us.
But he's understanding Beit El as the house of God, not the geographic location.
So Rashi tells us that the ladder has an angle that passes from where he is over Beit El. But Vayifga b'makom simply means, he happened upon this special place, didn't know, and had an amazing revelation. But there's a wordplay that the sages make in the Gemara, that Abraham, when he stands before God, is saying Shacharit, and when Isaac is meditating in the fields, he's saying mincha. And Jacob, when he yifga b'makom, which can mean, as Elliot said, it can mean an attack, like a terrorist attack. Pogea is to wound, and maybe there's an aspect of prayer that is like grabbing God by the lapels and yelling at God, but it also may mean simply the entreaty or the approach or the prayer. And makom, of course, is a epithet for God. So yifga b'makom means he ran into and prayed before, or maybe even attacked and yelled at the makom, God. But the unexpected part of it, when he has the dream and says, I didn't even know where I was totally unaware of the specialness of the moment, the specialness of the place, it suggests that he's not anticipating a sacred experience. And we can ask ourselves whether the most revelatory moments in our lives, our spiritual lives, are those that we've worked and prayed and prepared for and meditated towards, or whether the things that catch us, unawares, catch us by surprise. And that's a big spiritual element of surprise. There's a great Rav Kook teaching on this that said, Jacob, when he wakes up the next morning, he says, or wakes up at the dream and says, Vanochi lo yadati, I didn't realize how special it was. If I had known, I wouldn't have gone to sleep. As Rashi says, as Rav Kook said, Jacob didn't want the unawares revelation. He wanted to work for it. He didn't want the gift. He wanted to earn it, which I think is an interesting comment.
Well, is it determined by, the context? He is running. It's geographical. He is at, literally a crossroads in his life. Do we not get experiences? We call it liminality or peak experiences at the precise boundary between the known and the unknown. And here is a perfect illustration of it. Not only that, but we're getting this remarkable vision of the angels going up and down the sulam, which is, we often translate it as a ladder, but it's probably more like an elevated platform. Which I quoted Djokovic before. He says remarkably, it's like an inversion of the Tower of Babel or story. It's an answer to the Babel. We won't have to go into that, but the point is that all of this is coming to him precisely at the moment when he is in a peak awareness. I think that's what you're saying. Yeah.
The openness to surprise is one whole spiritual modality, and that's, Jacob certainly is unawares, but open to that surprise, and it makes it possible.
Well, or he could be aware of something else, and it may be that he is trying to leave God behind as well. And that's why God appears to him. That he is not looking for a place of God, which he very well might, right? He's alone at night. He's, I assume, worried about what will happen at night. He's in a place where he perhaps has not been. And he ends up with this encounter with God. And it's, in one sense, it's God reminding him that he can't escape God either.
Well, what you're saying is actually fascinating, because in pre-monotheistic religion, the gods were localized. And so what you have here is really a breakthrough in the evolution of monotheism, in which God is not localized to the land of Israel. God is going to go with him to Haran, to Lavan's household, and be with him there. And that is critically what is going on here. Let's advance to, so he makes the neder, he makes a vow, and of course we could spend a whole hour on the difference between the way God speaks to him and he speaks to God. He's very specific. V'shavti b'shalom al beit avi. I want to return to my father's household, and God has basically said, no, you'll come back to the land. And there are other things that are going on there that we don't have time or a magnifying glass to look at. But then in the very next scene, and the Torah, we always kind of remark on the literary beauty of the Torah, compresses the journey. Vayisa Yaakov raglav vayelech artzav v'nekedem. He goes, he lifts his feet, and then the very next verse, Vayar v'nei be'er basadeh. He just gets there. He's Scotty, beam me aboard. He gets beamed to Haran. It's quite a long journey on foot, and he arrives. And typically, according to our beautiful stories, he arrives at the well. And whom does he encounter at the well? And what goes on there?
totally surprised. Nobody saw this coming. He's going to go to the well. All the biblical characters meet their wives at wells. It's like it's the type scene of the Tanakh, the Torah. And lo and behold, of course, he meets Rachel, and it's love at first sight, or it's like it's just out of a past life. Vayishak Yaakov Rachel, and he kisses her and he cries. Vayisat kolo vayefk, and he lifts up his voice and cries in this moment of like overwhelming emotion and passion.
Have you ever commented on the onomatopoeia in the story? I always commented on this in my show. So she is tending to the sheep. V'hinei Rachel bito ba. Hinei Rachel bito ba. She is coming with the sheep. Okay, and of course.
I want to add, Jeremy, the way that you described it reminded me of Isaac when Rivka came, because Isaac also cried and he was comforted for the loss of his mother, and Jacob also was comforted by Rachel for the loss of his mother, who he left behind in Eretz Yisrael.
So there's a lovely set of midrash, I know, a lovely set of commentary on this, because he is saying, I have nothing. Look, when Eliezer came to the well, he was loaded with a whole caravan and goods and all sorts of precious gifts, nizamim, gold bands, everything. He was a whole jewelry store. And what does Jacob have? Nothing.
Yeah, no, that's not true. He has his strength because he is able to remove the rock.
Fine. Okay.
No, well, so think about it just for a moment. Eliezer wants Rivka to give him water and water his flocks.
Yes.
But Jacob is going to allow everyone to water their flocks. And I don't think we should
overlook that. I think you're right. And I would add to one thing, I would say he has no material possessions.
That's for sure.
Okay, he's got nothing in his pocket. However, he's got strength. And as we'll see, Vayishlach, he has an awareness of his potential. We'll talk about it next. Kiva Makli, when I went over the river with my staff. I only had my potential, and so while he is crying, he's crying because he has nothing, or he's crying because, according, he has a vision, and the vision is it's tragic. The vision is that he's going to lose her. I mean, and this is really, I think, a moment where love is compressed, the tragic element of love, in that there's a recognition that it's, all good things have to come to an end, and even love itself will end with the end of life, end of your life, and there's a tremendous, you're holding on to that moment of great pathos here. We have a lot
and then you have to get to Kohelet, where love is stronger than death.
Indeed. Okay. So what happens next? We're going to gloss over, just a little thing, but he's in love with her. He decides he wants to marry her, and he makes the bargain, the deal of the century, Jeremy.
Lavan, the sneaky father-in-law, never can be trusted. Jacob agrees to work 7 years, and he can marry Rachel, and he loves her so much, and they seemed like yamim achadim. They seemed like just a few days, those 7 long years of labor.
And we know that that phrase yamim achadim was the same phrase that Rivka used when she said, "You'll just go for a couple of days, yamim achadim," right? But the 7 years look like yamim achadim.
And that's how they come out. And he marries. He has a big wedding. But it's the Middle East, and they wear veils, and so he spends the night with the bride, and the next morning he discovers that a switcheroo has happened, and he's been with Leah the whole time, and he's been bamboozled, and they say to him, well, in our country, it's not done to privilege the younger before the elder. And this is one of the Torah's favorite narrative techniques is called midah keneged midah. It's measure for measure. what goes around comes around. What happens to you happens, what you do to someone else is going to happen again to you. So in case you think that the Torah was totally cool with Jacob deceiving Isaac to get the blessing in place of his older brother Esau, you know that actually the same thing is going to happen here, in which Jacob is going to be the one who is bamboozled and marry the person he doesn't really want to marry, because of these same expectations about elders and youngers. So they say to him, well, in our country, unlike where you're coming from, we keep the birth order. And they give him a little thumb in the eye. And there's a wonderful midrash that he says to Leah the next morning, "What in the throes of passion, I kept calling Rachel, Rachel, and you kept answering me." And she said, that reminds me of when Yitzchak asked you, Esav, Esav, and you answered him. So this is how it goes, right? This, what goes around comes around. And she says to him in that midrash, a great line, every sage has his students. So I learned it from you, big guy.
Well, so can we just ask the obvious question, which is, how did this happen? How did he not know?
Well, I don't think the question is how didn't he know, is when did he know?
It says, "Vayhi baboker v'hinei Leah." He wakes up and behold, she's Leah.
I think the answer is Arak.
Arak.
Not Iraq, but Iraq.
It's in Iraq, but it involved lots of Arak. So
It was between Arak and a hard place. Okay.
Right. So that brings us back to the Noah story, perhaps.
Interesting. Nice connection.
But I want to say something
And
else.
also to Lot. So
yeah.
But the other piece of it is that I think that the episode bespeaks the importance of place, because when Yaakov goes to Padan Aram, to Haran, he becomes one of them. Not necessarily by choice, but he keeps Leah. I assume he could have gone off in a huff and gone back home, but he sticks around. And that's why it's so important that, next week that he's going to actually come back to the land of Israel, because when you're in Galut, you act like you're in Galut, and you cannot retain your Israeliteness, let us say, outside of the land.
But that undercuts what you said so beautifully before about the extension of monotheism, the extension of the divine presence. Which I firmly agree with. It's like also in the very beginning of Ezekiel. Isaiah sees God in the heavenly temple, so to speak, in the Beit HaMikdash, and Ezekiel sees God in a chariot which moves. It goes with you to Babylon. And I think that, as you guys were saying before, Jacob might be at the borderline, and he sees the angels Olim v'Yordim. By tradition, the Eretz Yisrael angels leaving, and the Chutz La'aretz, the diaspora angels coming. But it's true that he is going to have and will have, throughout his time with Lavan, he'll continue to have this relationship. So, in a certain sense, you could say that it's the Eretz Yisraeli character that led him not to cut and run on Leah, because the shame that would have attended to that poor Miskena would have just been awful. And he comes through for her. He mans up and he stays with her and gets Rachel.
But it's his time with his father-in-law is a challenge, and he's tested over and over again. And it remains to be seen whether he pulls through completely the way that we want him to, or whether he is staying, let us say, by the land and by Laban.
But hovering over him is the echo of the promise that there's going to be a nation, and that the nation has not yet come into being. And so he knows that he has to begin producing a nation. And I think that is part of his self-awareness. In addition to the complexity that we said at the beginning, he's running away from himself. He's got this mission also, which is to be the founder. And he's also, I think he's got the memory of his grandfather, who was devoted to his early family. I think that Abraham's journey and taking Sarah and taking Lot with him was about the commitment to family. And it's not an accident. The Torah is so focused on the creation of family as the crucible of the moral life, the crucible of the covenant, the way we transmit the covenant. And here it's layered. He's got to have, he wants to create the family in order to create the nation. He wants to create the family in order to begin this very significant chapter.
Right. And here we have to recognize that half of his family comes from Leah.
Indeed.
Rachel, in terms of offspring, is no better than a handmaid.
Yeah.
She has the same number of each of the two handmaids. And Leah has as many boys as the three of them together, plus a daughter.
So fascinating. So let's go into that part of the story, because it is a very rich part of the Parsha here, where they begin to have children. Jeremy, take us into this.
This is one of my favorite passages in the whole Torah, because it gets into the emotional sensitivity of the Torah to the character of Leah. You know, I'm a davener with the imahot. I like putting the imahot in the beginning of the Amidah, and you know, I sometimes will think about the different characters and the stories that attend upon them. And with Leah, the element of what she has to go through as the unloved or the unwanted is just heartbreaking. It's so sad. So exactly as you said, she is the matriarchal figure par excellence. Sarah, you know, Bekoshi has one child, and Rebecca Bekoshi has one child, and Rachel Bekoshi has two children, one of which will kill her. Leah is Kigef Poriyah. She's the fruitful vine. She's the mother of 6 of the children. And the names that she gives the children are heartbreakingly, you know, the sensitivity is so deep. So she is the first child, it's Reuven. Ki ara'a Adonai be'onyi. Ki ata yehevani ishi. I call my son Reuven. The word means sight, see the child, because she says, God saw my suffering. Now my husband will love me. Doesn't come through. Then this Vatahar Od Vateled Ben, she gets pregnant again, has another child, and she says, Ki Shama Adonai Ki Snu'a Anochi. God has heard how unloved I am and given me this child also. She calls him Shimon, which means listening. Then she has a third child, and she says, Hapam Yilave Ishi Alai. This time finally, my husband will walk beside me. And so she calls him Levi. And that doesn't happen again. 3 children, 3 disappointments, and those names meaning her longing for his love never comes through. And then the 4th one, which is so awesome, and especially good for Thanksgiving Day, Vatahar Od Vateled Ben, Vatomer Hapam Odet Adonai. This time I will thank God. Alkein Karashmo Yehuda. So therefore she calls him Yehuda as a gesture of thanks. The first 3 times, she's hoping to win the unwinnable love from Yaakov. And the 4th time, she just turns to God and thanks God for her blessings. And I just think that's like astonishingly beautiful.
So ironically, she's the pious one of the 4 patriarchs. And, you know, there's something of a controversy that she's often mentioned after Rachel, because Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, and so Rachel is given precedence. But in fact, she is the crown of the patriarchs in many ways, because she is the one that contributes the piety and the religious message and the conversation with God. You think of Sarah, in the presence of God, she laughs. Rivka questions God, right? If this is what's going on with me, what do I need this for? And Rachel, frankly, her gods are her father's gods, not exactly our God.
He offers, Rachel contemplates suicide. Give me children, vim ayin meta.
Or give me death.
I'd rather die unless I get what I want.
Yeah, Patrick Henry picked up on that later. He changed it to liberty.
Wow. You know, I'm drawing the connection between this week and last week, because last week, Jeremy, you said the same thing about Esav. The Torah really has this tremendous sensitivity to the underdog and to the wronged party. And Esav in the past week, and Hagar also, you know, is considerably wrong. The Torah.
Right, so what each of them share is that they're the first, right? Hagar is the first wife, Leah is the older sister, Esav is the older brother. And even though the trope of the Torah is that the younger is going to prevail, the Torah also shows its respect to the older as the underdog. When the older is displaced, the Torah goes into that. And so we're left with this great tension, right? Yeah, go on.
I just want to say that we're running out of time. We want to fast forward to the end where there is this, again, another disjunction where through a series of events, Yaakov has to return to Canaan. And one of the events is he himself is running away. And another one of these moments is where God basically says, it's time to go back. He goes back, he runs back, and he runs like stealth, with stealth. Lavan runs after him, catches up to him, and the two have it out. And it's an extraordinary moment. We can't go into the text here. It's an extraordinary moment, but it ends with they make a covenant. They make a covenant. And Barry, they make a mound of stones, basically. What happened? So
they need some kind of memorial for the treaty that they've just entered into. And so they create this mound, Gal Eid in Hebrew, Sagar Yahaduta in Aramaic. These are the two words of Aramaic that appear in the Torah. And what's fascinating to me is that they build this mound of stones. They each go their own way. Lavan back east, Yaakov to the west, and they never see this mound of stones again. Right? It's just there to mark this treaty between Lavan and Yaakov, and they will never see it again. And the question that comes up sometimes is what gives the stones meaning? And the only thing that gives these stones meaning is the narrative, which if you don't know it, renders the stones meaningless.
I would go one step further and say the fact that they are in two languages indicates.
Well, that's because you Intel sign.
That's what?
Are you going one step further into Eretz Yisrael or back to?
I want to say that this is as symbolic a boundary as you can get. It's an ethnic, linguistic boundary, and it basically says, I am going to differentiate myself from you, period. You call this Yagar Sauduta, I call this Galeed. We are Hebrews here. Man, right. You have to get a visa to come into this land, basically. You just got to, when you come here, you got to speak my language. I mean, there's some defiance here.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I certainly do agree that this is a boundary story, and the theft of the household gods is an interesting piece, because it's not going to be for a little while that Jacob makes the people bury all. Is it next week Parsha that Jacob
chapter 35,
makes the people bury the idols that they have with them. So the idols do come with them a little bit. I'm going to be agnostic about this. It's a boundary story, but we are talking about a book that does include both the Hebrew and the Aramaic, and I think that every, Abraham and Rebecca and Yaakov, they have to make the journey from
absolutely
Padan Aram to Eretz Yisrael. That's the defining moment as they cross that border, and yet the border is itself part of the story.
Yeah, interesting, fascinating.
Right, and as you said at the beginning, Elliot, you can't escape your past. And that's why, in part, we have to have Lavan's name, thank you for correcting my mispronunciation, of Yagar Sahaduta, because that's part of the Israelite past as well. And it's a funny thing, a lot of us don't spell as well in Hebrew as we might like. So the question was asked today whether there's a connection between Trophim and Treif. And we know that the Trophim are Treif, but not because they're Treif in the sense of the expression, because that's spelled with a tet, not with a tuf.
Trophim, the household gods.
But, right, the household gods are called Trophim, which has its own meaning, unrelated to what we refer to unkosher meat as.
Yeah, interesting.
And and again, we have this combination of languages, Yiddish and Hebrew, and sometimes they shed interesting light in an unintentional way on each other.
Wow. Well, we have to put the boundary on our conversation. We're just getting started here.
This parsha, it's amazing to me. This parsha, these parshiyot in Breshit, we should, we could have like 2 or 3 a week.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we got Thanksgiving I think one of the things that I want to say I'm thankful for most, this opportunity. This has been a great part of our year. We've said this before, but prior to Rosh Hashanah, but I'll say it as part of Thanksgiving. I'm thankful to have the opportunity to have a chavruta every week, to share this Torah with everyone, and we are enjoying it. We wish everyone a beautiful Thanksgiving and a good Shabbos.
Good job,
See you next week on another
Shabbos.
edition of Parsha Talk.
All right, guys.